So we had talked about how we can implement the curb cut effect for their team meetings by having these best practices throughout that meeting life cycle. So before the meeting, is there an agenda? Is there clearly defined roles for the different teammates? During the meeting, is multimodal communication available? So like if it's a Zoom meeting, can we turn the captions on? Can we allow people to contribute in written form during or after the meeting for folks who may process information a little bit differently than others, right? After the meeting, can we have a shared task management software that we're using where those action items are captured? Maybe there's an assigned note taker during the meeting so that clears up everybody's bandwidth so they don't have to multitask during the meeting, and so on.
Welcome to the Neurodiversity in the Workplace podcast. Neurodiversity in the Workplace is a nonprofit consultancy working with corporate partners to create more neuroinclusive cultures and hiring practices. Our team of consultants debriefs weekly on different efforts that are happening with our clients, talking about wins, what we've learned, and we decided that instead of just having those as a team, we'd hit record and share them with the business community. So, Charles, what do you have for us this week?
Appreciate that introduction, Krista. So working with one of our partners who is a Fortune 500 company, they work on really large scale projects where it's fast moving, high stakes, they're bidding on different contracts, and that's kind of the lay of the land over at this particular partner. So as we were preparing to go out there for a Neurodiversity 101 training, I asked them to provide some case studies from the managers and teams at this organization, just talking about any interpersonal dynamics that they're having issues with that we could help address through this lens of neurodiversity best practices and consulting solutions, right? So they provided a few, and the red thread through all of these case studies that they had provided was this notion of the curb cut effect. And this is a really foundational tenet of our consulting practices that businesses appreciate as we get in there and offer these insights about how they can optimize their systems. So a little bit of background about the curb cut effect.
Yeah, really helpful.
Right. So what this looked like back in the day from a physical accessibility perspective was when we put curb cuts in the sidewalks, the use case or pain point that was being addressed was for folks who were wheelchair users who had physical mobility type of barriers that they were experiencing with regular sidewalks, right? But after those curb cuts became ubiquitous, many other audiences came out and said, we really appreciate this, right? So like travelers carrying luggage, people delivering packages, cyclists, skateboarders even.
I use them. I have a stroller. I feel like I'm constantly using the curb cuts.
Exactly. So it's one of those scenarios where it's not just more inclusive design, it's just better design. And the downstream impact was all these other audiences, not necessarily the folks who it was designed for, really appreciated that design. So what that could look like in a 2025 digital age context would be like, okay, thinking about the font choices in our emails, right? So if you use dyslexia friendly fonts and have at least 12-point font or larger, we know that this helps our dyslexic colleagues more fluently clear their inbox, right? But it's also appreciated by folks who are low vision, folks who are aging. Many other audiences appreciate that type of digital design, right? So a couple of the examples from this partner that we were working with, they had someone who was neurodivergent who was promoted to a leadership role. So they're running these team meetings. And again, it's a very fast-paced environment. Sometimes if there's a deadline coming up, that team meeting could be 2 to 3 hours long.
Okay.
And that particular leader was experiencing this circumstance where they would kind of forget action items or start having a tangential pattern of speaking and thinking during the meetings, and the team was having a hard time tracking, like, after the meeting, okay, what am I supposed to do to follow up, as well as going into the meeting, like, what exactly are we talking about here, because it feels all over the place, right? So we had talked about how we can implement the curb cut effect for their team meetings by having these best practices throughout that meeting life cycle. So before the meeting, is there an agenda? Is there clearly defined roles for the different teammates? During the meeting, is multimodal communication available? So like if it's a Zoom meeting, can we turn the captions on? Can we allow people to contribute in written form during or after the meeting for folks who may process information a little bit differently than others, right? After the meeting, can we have a shared task management software that we're using where those action items are captured? Maybe there's an assigned note taker during the meeting so that clears up everybody's bandwidth so they don't have to multitask during the meeting, and so on. So that was one of the specific case studies that came up with them. Another one was, we've seen that about 17 million Americans are experiencing long COVID right now. That was the most recent snapshot that we have. I remember when I was a accommodation specialist at the University of Alabama, I had the first student in Alabama who got accommodations for long COVID. And reading the letter from the neurologist, they're like, they're experiencing memory loss, processing speed and executive functioning difficulties compared to the baseline state that they were at. And it was like, we don't really have a prognosis here in terms of when or if this is going to resolve. They're studying for their exams. They're a 4.0 student, but no matter how much they are, studying and trying to rehearse the information, on test day, it's just not coming back to them, right? So understanding that 17 million of our colleagues could be experiencing something similar or their own version of some of these symptoms, if they're having that memory loss and executive functioning challenges during team meetings, having these best practices in place also are going to help those folks, not just the folks who are most often associated with neurodivergence, right? As well as they had a colleague in their group who was grieving the loss of a parent. And for any of us who've gone through that grief process, it can just level you throughout the day, right? And if that happens during a team meeting, maybe you miss that action item and that causes miscommunication, and you miss the deadline and costs the company money, and it's bad for business, right? So by having, again, that agenda beforehand, the note takers, the task management system, the multimodal communication, not only is that can be appreciated by your neurodivergent colleagues, but folks who are in that grief process, experiencing long COVID, many other audiences appreciate that type of design. So it's been really exciting to work with some of those companies, talk to the managers after that presentation, and they were like, okay, these best practices are going to work. We're going to start doing this, have that before, during, and after system in place rather than just freewheeling with our meetings. And I was glad to see that it resonated with them.
I love that. As you were talking about being an accommodation specialist and having that student who all of a sudden is now experiencing this change in how their brain perceives information, retains information, prepares information, it just kind of resonated with me that, oftentimes we're talking about neurodivergence, right? But when we're talking about the curb cut effect and this universal design or better design, it's that these things can happen suddenly to people. They may be long-term, they may be short-term, but when we make design changes that are universally better, that focus on neuroinclusion and really neuroaffirming practices, we are creating a system that's better for everyone, regardless of what experience they might be going through. And I'm sure your student at University of Alabama really appreciated that and hopefully was able to carry some of those lessons as they also went into the corporate world. But It's really fascinating.
Yeah, I think there is this misconception of like neurodivergence is something that you're born with, but it can be, it's not a static state in terms of how your brain and nervous system works, right? That can change across the lifespan. And even, it could be even something, I mean, we're both parents, right? So during that first year, probably weren't getting much sleep up every couple hours during the night. I remember going into work after a sleepless night with a 3-month-old at home and being like, wow, I'm just not focusing and retaining this information very well during meetings, right? So it's about raising that flexibility and empathy for folks regardless of where they're at, because it's one of those life happens things, right? So if you're designing for somebody who is autistic or dyslexic or ADHD, again, that design is going to be appreciated by all of these other audiences, the parents with infants at home, the folks grieving loved ones, the folks with long COVID, all of these other audiences that you may not have intended with this inclusive meeting design and having that system in place. But again, that downstream impact is going to be felt by other people who you may not have had in mind when you put that solution in place.
And even if there's those external factors, like you said, if you're not getting sleep, you're right, those early months with kids or new pets even, right? Like those things can deprive you of your normal routine. So having that foundation in place for good, solid design and meeting behaviors, as we're talking at this particular client, really allows people to have the tools and supports that they need, even when they may not feel that they're performing at their best because of a variety of external factors, like a lack of sleep or grief or just other things that are happening in their life.
Yeah, and totally. And it's always great when these just elegant, low to no cost solutions create that win-win for the business as well, right? So for this particular partner, if they miss a contract deadline, that could be millions of dollars lost, and they may not get the next contract, hurts their reputation in the space, and so on. So again, this really light lift, no to low cost solution, right? It doesn't cost you anything to send out an agenda beforehand, to have multimodal communication available before and after, the action items afterwards. It doesn't cost you anything, and it improves the efficiency of your teams and limits that miscommunication that can be really costly.
That's great. I mean, and I'm so glad to hear that this partner has continued to build on their neuroinclusion journey. I want to ask you a question. For companies or talent acquisition professionals who maybe haven't yet embarked on neuroinclusion or even thinking about the curb cut effect and universal design, what are maybe some areas that they could start in their daily practices?
Absolutely. Yeah, again, the good news is that most of these solutions are low to no cost, light lift, readily available, right? So it doesn't cost you anything to change the font in your emails to a dyslexia-friendly font that's at least 12 point or larger, really good contrast, and so on. In terms of onboarding practices, having a cadence of communication with your new hires, deliberately asking them questions about, what are your communication preferences? What is your learning style? What are your sensory preferences? How else can I support you? And having that be initiated from that leadership level rather than those folks who are new to your organization trying to assimilate and impress, having to do an ask up, like having it be an ask down from the leadership, like how can I help you, makes a huge difference. Some of those other pieces related to like skill-based hiring versus the traditional behavioral interviewing, all of those elements, again, don't really cost you a thing and can make a huge difference for many different audiences.
Right. Or even like you were saying, attaching an agenda to the meeting. Maybe that can be our challenge. If you have not yet attached agendas to your meeting, challenge yourself this week to try that out and see how everyone can maybe benefit from that.
I like that.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll also hold ourselves accountable to it. But Thanks so much, Charles. I really appreciate it.
Likewise. Thanks, Krista.